Hi, and welcome to this edition of One-on-One, brought to you by Citi. I'm Howie Rose, and today we are going to go back to the very, very beginning of New York Mets history and chat with the very first winning pitcher in franchise history, and that is Jay Hook. And before we get started, let me remind you, as always, that ever since 2016, for every Mets home run that's hit at Citi Field, Citi has donated $2,000 to No Kid Hungry. And while we now anxiously await more Mets home runs at Citi Field, Citi and the Citi Foundation have continued to support No Kid Hungry, providing $7 million in support just since March. New estimates show that 1 in 4 children in the United States could face hunger this year because of the coronavirus. So now more than ever, we ask you to join Citi in the fight against childhood hunger. To donate, visit NoKidHungry.org. I hope you'll do that. But in the meantime, I hope you'll enjoy our conversation with Jay Hook. Jay, it's great to see you. How are you today?
I'm fine, Howie. How are you?
I'm doing well. We're all excited about baseball ramping up pretty soon. How much baseball do you watch nowadays?
Zero.
Well, yeah.
We live on a farm, Howie, in northern Michigan and northern part of the lower peninsula. And I watch a lot of high school baseball now, and that's kind of the thing to do in our area.
For those who aren't familiar with Jay Hook's story, it intertwines with where the Mets were when Jay took the mound on the night of April 23rd, 1962 in Pittsburgh. Talk about two teams that were going in opposite directions at the time. The brand new Mets had yet to win a game. They lost their first 9, while the Pirates, just a couple of years removed from being world champions, won their first 10. So it was the 0-9 Mets against the 10-0 Pittsburgh Pirates when Jay Hook took the mound that night at Forbes Field. What were your reasonable expectations getting ready in the bullpen, Jay?
Well, we had a lot of experienced players on that team, Howie. A lot of old Brooklyn Dodgers, and I never had the expectation that we would lose as many games as we did, and particularly at the start of the season. This was my second start, and the Pirates had, I think, won 9 or 10 straight, and we had lost 9. And I couldn't believe it could go much further. But you never know, I guess, in baseball when you start the game.
One thing I've learned over the years is that, and sadly, this might be now going the way of the dinosaur, at least for this year upcoming, it will be, but pitchers, no matter how well they do on the mound in any given game, if they get a hit and help themselves out, drive in a couple of runs, maybe even hit a home run, that's all those guys want to talk about when the game is over. So, Jay, not only did you win the game 9-1, but in the second inning, you had a 2-run single. Was that perhaps as enticing a conversation topic for you as winning for the first time in franchise history?
Well, I certainly, back then I liked to feel good about it. but Howie, when Jay Horowitz called me, and I was asking me about some information about that game, who was the catcher and that sort of thing. I really couldn't, I didn't know whether it was Chris Cannizzaro or Hobie Landreth. I couldn't remember which.
It was Cannizzaro.
Yeah, and it was Cannizzaro. But I went on the internet and I looked up first Mets win on the internet, and I couldn't believe it. There was a lot of information in it, but it went through a play-by-play of every inning, and it refreshed my memory on that second inning when I got a hit with the bases loaded and 2 runs scored. So I felt very good about that.
Yeah, you guys broke that game open early with 4 runs in the second inning. When you drove in half of them, you had scored 2 runs in the first. And from what you can remember about the game, if not necessarily all the play-by-play or the batting order, do you remember how much more relaxed you must have been getting a nice big juicy lead early on against a team that could rake?
Well, it was nice getting a lead, but you never got relaxed. I think I lost that first year with the Mets. I think I lost 12 or 13 games by 1 run. Yeah. So you can't get comfortable.
For those who don't know, that 62 Mets has such an interesting chunk of baseball history, but it's somewhat romanticized in New York because They're an expansion team. They won 40 games. They lost 120. Nobody has won fewer than that. Nobody has lost more than that since. Although you go back to 2003, and Jay, I don't know if you paid any attention to this, but the Detroit Tigers were on a course most of that year to lose more and win less than you guys did. Now, is there anything about that 40 and 120 that you guys somehow cling to and with an almost proprietary interest, where you're rooting for the Tigers to just lose one less game somehow?
Well, there were some sports writers around in our a town close to us, Traverse City, Michigan, and they contacted me when the Tigers were losing so many games, and a couple of the sports writers there were friends of mine, and they said, "Oh, Jay, don't you want to go down to the Tiger Stadium? It was still in the old park, and see this because they may break your record." And I had a lot of people calling and get interviews. The Mets must have been giving out my phone number or something, but I had calls from all over the country about, are you happy that the Mets will, somehow not sustain that record of 120 losses? Because I think they lost 118 or 119, something
119,
like that. The LA Times asked me to do an op-ed piece for them around that time. And the thing I said was that, Casey Stengel had been so successful in New York and won so many championships and everything. And I can't remember the guy that was the manager of the Tigers at that point, but he was a young guy. I think it was one of his first years as managing. And I think I said was he didn't deserve to break that record. Didn't hurt Casey at all, but I think it hurt him quite a bit to lose that many games. But I was glad they didn't break that record, because there were some good players on that team. And in this op-ed piece I wrote about, even though we were such an unsuccessful team as a record, there were a lot of guys on that team that went on to good success and other careers, and some in baseball. I mean, Roger Craig went on to, coach and manage. Obie Landreth went on to be a vice president of Volkswagen. Richie Ashburn went on to be an announcer in Philadelphia and had a successful career. Roadblock Jones, I think he became a sheriff or something out in Kansas. And, just because we had lost that many games, we weren't losers. I went on to do a number of different things after baseball. So, even though we lost, and there were a lot of guys on the team, Gil Hodges and a number of guys that had, they had a successful career, and that was a bad year.
And Casey Stengel was right in the middle of it. I don't know how much you knew about Casey when you were a young pitcher with the Cincinnati Reds, but when you found out that you would be part of the original Mets beginning play in 1962, how did your relationship with Casey evolve? And, you hear so many stories about him. He'd fall asleep on the bench. He wasn't really into it mentally. He was, just kind of, there without having much of an impact. But a lot of that, I'm sure, became kind of urban legend. What was your personal impression of Casey?
Casey Stengel was one of the brightest, most quick-witted guys I ever met. And I've used him as an example in other businesses and other kind of situations, because Casey, he knew who his customers were, and his customers really, they were eventually the people that came and bought tickets or watched on television. But he knew at that time there were 12 or 13 papers in New York. And he knew that those writers had to have a story the next day. And after a game, no matter win, lose, or draw, he'd call them into his office. He'd sit, get them a beer or get them a Coke or whatever, and he'd sit and he'd tell them stories. And by the time they left that office, they had a story for the next day's paper. And he knew that he got to all those customers that came in and paid through those sports writers. And he was terrific with all that stuff. And he knew details of baseball. And I wish I'd have read his book that got later published about his life and when he started out and all the things he did. he was a phenomenal guy, and I've used that in business and in education and other places. You got to know who your customers are and how you can make their job the best job for them.
And your business not only is education right now, I understand you're still teaching at Northwestern. You were going to Northwestern between baseball seasons back when you were still an active player, and had a pretty interesting career in business too. So why don't you give us the rundown on what life after baseball has been like for you?
Well, I was interested in cars and souping up cars and things like that when I was young. And I kept going on to grad school while I was playing baseball. And after I got out of baseball, I realized after I had 5 years in the major leagues that I'd better find another career, because I was just an average baseball player. And we didn't make any money then. I think the minimum salary in the major leagues back then was $7,000 a year. So everybody got jobs in the wintertime. Not everybody, but quite a few. And so after I got out of baseball, I went to work for Chrysler Corporation, working on cars, the future of cars and all that. Then I left that and went to a company by the name of Rockwell International. Well, they were in the space race. They were in a lot of different things. And I managed a bunch of companies for them. And then I was hired by a conglomerate by the name of Masco Corporation. And at that place, I think we acquired a lot of businesses during that time. And I retired early from that when I was like 51 or 2, and became a professor at Northwestern, as you indicated. But I did that for about 7 years. And then I retired from that and became a farmer.
That's quite a turnaround.
So I live on a farm now, but I've been very active in things. I was chairman of the board of a seminary. I was chairman of the board of a community college here, their foundation. Right now, I'm chairman of the board of a hospital in our area. And those weren't money makers. They're all, they were kind of almost volunteer in most cases. But it's been great, and it's kept me active and involved in different things. And I look back and this time with the Mets, it was a terrific time, Howie. We met the first 7 years my wife and I were married. We moved 22 times. We lived all over the country, and it was a great experience. We have 4 kids. We have 13 grandchildren now.
That's great.
I look at it, and I guess you figure how can you be of service to different organizations, and that's kind of what I've done.
Well, that included teaching. So do you see the irony in the fact that you played for a manager that was called the old professor, but that's what he called you? Casey called you professor, am I right?
He did, yeah. I have to tell you a cute story. I still get, 8 or 10 letters a month with baseball cards in them. And it was because of this first Mets win, and that was 58 years ago or something. But just this week, I got several different things. One was from a 9-year-old boy, and he had a baseball card in it. And he wanted to tell me how he missed baseball, and how his dad and he played baseball in the backyard with their 6-year-old brother, and all, and it was just, it's been fun to stay a little bit connected with baseball just through this kind of thing, and I enjoy reading these little letters that I get, and seeing the old baseball card. That.
Did you also enjoy the attention that you must have received after winning that first game? Because as you mentioned, there were a lot of newspapers in New York back then. What was that scenario like, surrounding you, presumably with a winning baseball of the first victory in New York Mets history? What was that post-game situation like?
Well, the baseball books that are written about that, people that have called and written books, they talk about that a little bit, because after the game, Casey said to the writers, he said to me, take as long as the writers want to talk to you, keep talking, kind of thing. And so we were catching a flight to go to Cincinnati or somewhere else, and I took quite a while. You know, the writers wanted to ask a lot of questions and that sort of thing. And by the time it was time, you know, everybody else had been through the shower and getting dressed and everything. And I went to get in the shower, and they had run out of hot water at Ford Field. And so I went in the trainer's room, and there was a whirlpool in there. So I jumped in the whirlpool because the water was still warm in the whirlpool. And then I went out and got on the bus, you know, but I've laughed when I think about that.
What did you do with a baseball?
Well, you probably, you know that that's back in Mets ownership now, but I should write down Rusty Staub because I'll remember that name. I took the baseball. I wrote on it that it was the first Mets win. I wrote my name and wrote the score of the game and all that stuff on the ball. And I took it home to my parents' home, which was in Northern Illinois, and just put it in a drawer at their house. Well, when I got out of baseball, I went to work for Chrysler, as I mentioned, and I thought, you know, I should give that ball back to the Mets. They should own it rather than me owning it, which probably was a mistake. I'd have made a little money.
Yeah, well, that'd be worth some coin.
Right. I gave it, I arranged, and Donald Grant accepted the ball back. I had Chrysler make up a really nice case for it, a glass case with mahogany base and a plaque on the front. And then I took it to New York. My son and I drove to New York, and we gave it back to Donald Grant at home plate before a game in 1967. And the ball went up in in Shea Stadium. There was a bar up there that the ball was sat on the back of the bar.
Diamond Club, probably. Yeah.
Right. And we had seen it when we were back for some old timer stuff, but then it disappeared, and I never knew what happened to the ball until about a year ago last May. And I got this call from Jay Horowitz, and he said, Jay, there's a baseball that on Sotheby's auction, and it's going for $25,000 or $30,000 or something like that. And I said, Jay, I've signed hundreds of baseballs. None of them are worth that kind of money. and he said, well, I said, have you seen the ball? And he said, no, but when I see it, I'll send you a picture of it. Well, it was the ball that was in that case. And what had happened to the ball, I learned later, because somebody in one of the New York papers kind of went back and did the history of this. But Mrs. Payson, who owned the Mets at that time, when I think she passed away, and her daughter became president of the Mets, I think, owner of the Mets.
Yes.
And then they sold the ball to the current owners, or to the Sotheby, or not the Sotheby, the Doubleday Corporation, and then the current owners got involved with it. And what happened was, when that ownership change took place, the granddaughters, there were two granddaughters, and they must have said, well, the ball doesn't need to go with the club. We'll keep it, because I had written on the thing, given to Mrs. Payson, and so one daughter kept it for 20 years, and then she gave it to her sister to keep for 20 years. And then they were trying to decide what to do with that ball in their estates. And Rusty Staub had a foundation there in New York. And so they thought, well, maybe we should leave it to give it to Rusty Staub so he could sell it or whatever and give the money. He was doing, charities for Catholic charities and police and firemen in New York and stuff like that. Well, so they gave it to Rusty Staub for his foundation. And then after he passed away, I think, a year or two
just a couple
ago,
years
Mark,
ago,
his lawyer, or whoever was handling his estate, was supposed to sell everything and give the money to the charities. Well, they put it up for sale with Sotheby's. and the Mets saw it on there. And of course, by then, no one really knew that ball because it was all newer people from the old days, you know. And so they ended up buying it. And now it's at the park in New York now in their history organization there.
Yeah, the Mets have a Hall of Fame and museum at Citi Field.
Right. So the ball's sitting there, and we have a granddaughter living in New York. She works for Lululemon, and her husband is a music guy on Broadway, and they went to the park and took a picture of it and sent it to me. So
that's great.
I haven't been there to see it, but I've seen it remotely.
So Jay Hook, you're immortal because that ball is going to live on forever as far as the New York Mets are concerned. And you had such a big part of it. And when you think back on your major league career now, specifically to those two plus years that you played with the New York Mets, can you appreciate your place in the history of a franchise that's, you know, gone on to write a pretty interesting story for itself over nearly 60 years now?
Yeah, that's very true. Well, you know, I don't give it a lot of thought, but you know, it was sure a great time in my life. And when people say what was your biggest thrill in baseball, that certainly was it.
Well, we've really enjoyed getting to chat with you, Jay, and look back on the very first victory in the history of the New York Mets with that game's winning pitcher, original Met, Jay Hook. Jay, thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe, stay well.
Thanks, Howie. And I see New York is opening up again, and you know, I hope things get back to normal there. And I understand that maybe they're going to play a 60 game season or something like that.
That's the plan.
Yeah, good. Anyway, nice to speak with you.
Before I let you go, something else just came to me. I just had this vision of, it was in a book. Jack Lang had done a book at the end of the '86 season when the Mets had won the World Series. And there's a picture in there, I believe. And you, with an engineering background, did you make the nameplate and perhaps even give Marvelous Marv Throneberry his nickname? Was that, there was some connection there too, was there not?
Yeah, there was.
Well, thanks. We're going to stop here. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to have a little more content from this interview available for you, and that is going to be at cityentertainment.com. So join us there.